listeners. The episode you're about to hear is a 3-hour-long episode that I recorded with Kat Kemp about the movie Freaks from 1932. It's an incredible episode, I think one of my best, and only the first hour and a half is going to be available for free for my regular listeners. So if you are just itching to get that next hour and a half of this discussion, you'll just have to sign up for my Patreon. My patrons got this episode early and they also got it in full. That is patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. And you're going to want to sign up at the Woman on the Warpath, Vampire Lovers, or Murder Mommy tiers to get this episode. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you sign up. We've got a wonderful Discord community and so much supplemental education and discussion going on over there. I hope to see you soon.
You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together.
Listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo. I'm back with another main episode, and I say this about every episode, but I genuinely mean it. I'm so excited to talk to my guests today. We're going to talk about the 1932 film Freaks, directed by Tod Browning. This is a film that I have wanted to do since I started doing this podcast back in 2019, and I'm thrilled to be talking about it with my guest today, Katrina Kemp. Hi, Katrina.
Hey.
Katrina, we were introduced through a mutual friend, and she's generously agreed to come and talk about this movie with me. And before we get
I'm honored.
I'm honored too. I mean, I'm like, we're going to talk about it, but like, I'm a huge Phantom of the Opera fan, and
Me
Katrina's,
too, girl.
Katrina's going to tell you, you're about to tour with Love Never Dies. So, but I'm
Yes, the
getting ahead of
sequel
myself. Yeah.
to Phantom.
The sequel to Phantom. I'm getting ahead of myself. Katrina, can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So my name is Katrina Kemp, and I was connected to Annie through my friend Eugene, who is a person with dwarfism. And we've been friends through the community Little People of America because we're both people with dwarfism who attend this event that happens multiple times throughout the year, where groups of little people from around the country or the world get together, and all of us have like a giant blowout celebration for an entire week or weekend. And he and I just always connected on working within the entertainment industry, and just the effect that little people have on pop culture. And he knows that I'm a performer, I'm a comedian, I'm a singer, and I've had the privilege and opportunity to be in multiple TV shows and productions and stage shows that deal with showing disability in a more positive light and having the ability to talk and engage with people about disability rights and disabled people in the arts without the threat of being exploited, and maybe talk about those themes as well through playing the character. And yes, I have toured for 18 months between 2017 and 2018 with the show Love Never Dies, which is the Andrew Lloyd Webber sequel to the Phantom of the Opera musical. And I completed 410 shows of that tour as a principal character, which is virtually unheard of for a person with dwarfism. And I greatly, greatly thank Andrew and his team for envisioning that character as a person with dwarfism. And the character's name is Fleck, the aerialist extraordinaire. And she essentially plays Phantom's right-hand henchwoman. And when the pandemic hit, I became more closely involved with my post-production side of my career, where I am the story associate producer on RuPaul's Drag Race, and have been working on that for the past couple of years. And now that Andrew's longtime goal, I believe, has to have Love Never Dies go on tour to Asia. And so I got the call this year that he wants me to come back as Fleck and complete an almost year-long tour of multiple cities in China. So right now I know that I'm going to Shanghai to open the show, and I'm leaving in 2 days to begin the rehearsals in the UK. And I'm super excited. And I saw that you're a fan of Phantom, and I was like, okay, it's meant to be. We gotta get this going. We gotta hook up on this.
We're talking to a celebrity, guys, on the podcast today. I did. That's so exciting and amazing. And, I'm a huge fan of the show. I'm a huge fan of the book. I'm like a big Phantom of the Opera fan. And I actually did a bonus episode for this show which is on my Patreon, is patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo for anybody listening, if you want to sign up and listen, about the book, the stage production, the films. It was like a big bonus episode with my friend Sid Branca, and we talked about themes, of course, of disability, and I also did like 6 weeks on my Patreon of just screening different adaptations of The Phantom and introducing them for my patrons. So obviously a big fan.
Oh, I love that.
I feel like it's really like kismet. I mean, also the theme that I'm doing this month for the Patreon is about horror, freakery, and the carnivalesque. So I sort of my themes. So I had the Phantom theme, and then I've sort of moved into fairy tales, erotic fairy tales, because fairy tales also have a ton of themes about disability, and also Phantom of the Opera is basically Beauty and the Beast, right? So we talked about fairy tales, and now we're moving into the carnivalesque. So it's all connected. It's all really connected. So you're literally the perfect person to talk about this with, and I'm totally nerding out. So before we get into some of the history of sideshows, I wanted to ask you, Katrina, what is your experience with this film? When did you first see it? How did you feel about it? How do you feel about it now?
Well, it's funny because I, always considered myself a connoisseur of dwarfism history and love educating people when they have questions, because people are filled with questions when they've never met somebody with dwarfism. It's everything from curiosity to exploitation to just downright like ridiculous questions. And I'm always like that person that will try to remain like as patient as possible if I'm in the mood that day.
Right.
But what shocked me is that by the time I was 21, I had actually never heard of this film. And I was dating a woman at the time who I still wasn't fully out of the closet at that time even. And she was somebody who was very much into cult films and horror. And so she educated me on this film and showed me what it was. And I was instantly captivated and obsessed and like, this is a part of my identity now. Because it does feel like it is a part of my dwarfism community's history in the way that, Wizard of Oz would be upheld in that way. And there's a select few of people who have asked me about this film over the years, and I'm so happy when I get a chance to meet those people because they usually tend to be very empathetic and educated people on multiple subjects and what was going on within history at that time. And I love this film so much. And so the first time I watched it, I was experiencing such a catharsis that blew my expectations of what little people in America were capable of during that time period, because I only knew of like, Billy Barty was somebody who, he really was like a change maker and somebody who was a child during the time that this film Freaks had come out, and then was in so many productions and was changing so many people's ideas about what people with dwarfism were capable of in society, that he was really only my like take on it. And then as I dive deeper past the film, I I ended up joining the circus. And in 2011, I really, really started deep diving on the history of P.T. Barnum, dwarfism, exploitation, and how even in modern day society, we still have remnants of this exploitation that goes on. And I knew ever since I was a child, deep down somewhere in my DNA, that was very real, and that it was going to be one of my MOs and one of my missions in life to change and subvert that narrative of not just people with dwarfism, but to be an advocate for people with disabilities in art and expressing yourself. And I just love the film so much. And it's interesting that at that time, little people would have been given the opportunity to be in sideshows, and it must have been like in such a wild encounter to see little people on a big screen being treated like a movie star, when for the people with dwarfism living in the real world, they were not able to attend a regular public school and learn how to read and write until the 1950s because of people like Billy Barty, who some would say, looking at his old stuff, might verge on somebody exploiting themselves, like for comedic purposes and using their height as a way to express himself and stories. But he was using that vehicle to change real world lives within society. So he really began Little People of America as a way to bridge the community. And he was like, you make shoes? Cool. You make furniture? Great. You know how to, fix things and fix cars and get people driving. Let's all get together as a community. And then he started changing government policies, allowing people with dwarfism to begin going to school, getting regular jobs, and advocating for them in that way. I don't know how he felt about the movie Freaks, but I would be very, very interested to find out.
Yeah, if anybody wants to email me, girlsgutsjill@gmail.com. If you know about that, please get in touch with us. Yeah. My experience with this film was I saw it in high school, and I've always been obsessed with horror, obviously. And I saw it on a show called Bravo's Scariest Movie Moments. And, and it's the climax of the film. And when I watched the film, I didn't find it scary because I was totally rooting for them. And I was like, yeah, I get her ass. So
Freaking bitch.
Right. She's such a bitch. And I felt totally aligned with the freaks and was cheering for them. And sure, it's like scary imagery, it's dark, it's stormy, it's raining, like there's knives, there's horror there, but not in the way that it had been talked about on that show. And I immediately felt like, I think, this is something I was talking about with my girlfriend last night. I think as somebody who is a dyke and a weirdo and has tattoos and is a fat person and has disabilities myself related to chronic pain, I always felt aligned with these characters.
Right.
And that these were my people. And I found it very moving, and I still find it very moving watching it all these years later and having watched it many times now. And I think it's just a very enigmatic, singular film. There's really nothing else like it, even to this day. Even I was rewatching the American Horror Story Freak Show season, and even that also showcases a lot of performers with disabilities, and it's very entertaining, but it just cannot compare to this. This is just something else entirely. And we're gonna get into it. So before we get into the movie, I want to talk about some of the history of sideshows, because I really wanted to give this topic the full research that it deserves, because I think that a lot of people listening to this are interested in these topics and probably know about some of this stuff. But I think giving the whole context of what we're talking about here will really drive home the importance of this film. So I got almost all of my information about the history of sideshows from the book Freak Show: Presenting Human Oddities by Robert Bogdan. And so Robert Bogdan says that the closest ancestors to the sideshow started in the early Renaissance, where people, even then with disabilities, were being exhibited or exhibiting themselves in sideshows for a fee. Human oddities, as they were called, quote unquote, were shown usually as single attractions as opposed to being part of a troupe. That came later. And with the troupe atmosphere and the carnival atmosphere, that is when disabled people and performers started to form communities. And before that, they lived very isolated sort of existences, not around other people of their experience. The first time that we see, because we're really talking about American sideshows today, the first time that we see an ad for an American sideshow was in 1738. And it was an ad about a woman who was taken, quote unquote, very chilling, in a wood in Guinea, a female about 4 feet high, in every part like a woman, excepting her head, which nearly resembles the ape. Of course, we don't actually know much about the real woman here that they're describing. But so decades before the American Revolution, there were human exhibits who were later going to be called freaks. And that is the terminology I'm going to be using throughout, because that is the terminology of the film and the terminology of these sideshows. And they were being presented. But this was also, of course, heavily racialized. And something that I knew already intuitively, but didn't know really until I read this book, was the history of race and disability as being very enmeshed in the U.S. People
and exploitation, yes, and colonization.
Exactly. Yeah. Even, this woman with dwarfism who's taken in the wood in Guinea, that really encapsulates this, the history of race and disability and eugenics and race science is extremely tied together here. People from non-Western societies were being exhibited as oddities along with people with missing limbs or people with dwarfism. So it was seen as as the same thing to the colonial white gaze. And by the late 18th century, the belief that human oddities were evil omens or workings of witchcraft, right? Because people who look different have always been subjected to that. Their works that's the devil. That's the deformity is evidence of evil, or punishment for transgressions. So that idea was fading and was being replaced with this idea that everybody is part of God's great order of creatures, and therefore subject to scientific study and classification. So it's never it's never
that's all.
Right, exactly. It's never benevolent. It's never and that means we should leave them alone.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that during this exact same time period of the 1700s and before that, we have such clear evidence of, for example, people with dwarfism being bought, sold, and traded as slaves among royalty. And that was a person with dwarfism's purpose. And perhaps if you had another type of disability, you may be taken in beyond the castle walls. But if you were not performing or doing some kind of interesting, whatever exploitation of yourself, you were cast out of the community and probably killed because your peasant family could not take care of you.
Right. Yeah, there's so many paintings and such from the Renaissance which showcase that, exactly what you're talking about, where people would be and this is again, race and disability comes into play together. People would be painted with their quote unquote possessions. And some of those possessions were literal human beings, like people with dwarfism or enslaved people. And you can see that in some paintings. Like there's also people with dwarfism would model for paintings in the Renaissance where there was supposed to be a scene of like chaos and decadence, like Tintoretto's Last Supper. There were people with dwarfism, I believe, to kind of show like this sort of debauched party atmosphere.
And it's either always that, depicted as that, or the nobility always has a hand placed on top of their head.
Right.
To show their strength and show what they're capable of doing, is that they are wealthy and noble enough to own another human being that quote unquote needs them. Yeah, it's horrific, and it only just continued up until the point that what I think even people with disabilities find hard to admit sometimes is that sideshows and circus became a way out of that subservient life. And it became a way for them to connect with other people in the disability community and people who were empathetic and felt like just completely comfortable around people with disabilities when doing their job.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of camaraderie between, and also tension, as we're going to see in the film too, between like the quote unquote self-made freaks and like the natural born quote unquote freaks. So by the late 18th century, well, actually, in the last decades of the 18th century, in the first decades of the 19th, scientists began to open museums in American cities that were hodgepodges of exhibits, like paintings, stuffed animals, and I don't mean like teddy bears, I mean like stuffed cheetahs, like you would see in the American Museum of Natural History, live animals, wax figures, mechanical devices, light shows, and other artifacts brought back by sailors and explorers. And human curiosities were exhibited from the start. So people from non-Western cultures as well as disabled people were of interest. And the science of teratology, meaning the science of disability and specifically of deformity, was really like on the rise at this time. So human oddities were absorbed fully by museums by the mid 1800s. And there wasn't a community. These acts were being exhibited as independent oddities, or were often it was their family who was doing it to make money, to take care of them, or outright exploiting them. And they were not attached to community at this time. So, but by becoming attached to museums and later to circuses, showmen and exhibits were incorporated into like a burgeoning industry of the amusement industry, and thus joined the segment of the society that was in process of developing a way of life apart from the mainstream. So we're starting to get subculture. And The freak show took on a life of its own. P.T. Barnum seized on the idea of the museum as an amusement center and launched what's called the American Museum in 1841. So the cabinet, what was originally called the Cabinet of Curiosities, transformed into the Dime Museum. So overnight, Barnum transformed the museum into an entertainment center where families could come with picnic lunches and spend the day. And by 1850, it was the premier attraction of New York City. A fire destroyed the American Museum in 1868. Barnum is known for the circus, but it was really the museum that was his primary calling, and it was a national force. So out of the American Museum comes what are called the Dime Museum. So those are early sideshows. So freak shows were the main attractions from 1870 to 1900. And upsettingly, freak hunting was now a full-time occupation. So managers and their agents would search the world for people with anomalies to exhibit. Dime museums eventually became so sleazy and fraudulent that quote-unquote respectable citizens began to desert them, leaving them to immigrants and country bumpkins, and that's what the carnival culture is eventually going to come out of. So as a sideshow, the freak show was an integral part of the circus and circus culture. So circuses have many elements: jugglers, aerial artists, clowns, trained animals, menageries, museums, and that all of those arts existed independently in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and they all come together in the mid 1800s to form the circus. And by the turn of the century, there was close to 100 circuses around the U.S. During its golden era from roughly 1870 to 1920, the circus was the major organization of popular amusement for rural Americans. By the 1920s, it was declining because cities and even small towns had movie houses and vaudeville tours, and the radio was becoming a force. So by the end of the 1930s, circuses are seriously economically suffering. So single human oddities started hooking up with traveling circuses in the early 1800s, but it was only towards the mid-century that they're organized into anything like a sideshow. And museums began traveling with circuses around 1837. By 1880, the freak show is the main attraction, and it becomes a standard circus fixture. It made the most money for the circuses. So there's so much history here with like the devaluing of the people that are making the most money. Like the circus could not survive. Basically what I found out was that they could not have survived without these sideshows. Amusement parks also started to develop because of stuff like the World's Fair, where people could go on a Ferris wheel. That started to become very popular. Coney Island, which I know Love Never Dies, is set on Coney Island. So,
yes.
Yeah. 1907, yeah. So Coney Island became a bustling resort in the 1870s. And the first freak show there was in 1880. And Coney Island became an epicenter for freak shows. So exactly during this period where the show is set, between like 1910 and 1940, no single place in the world had more human oddities on exhibit. There were really renowned performers like Lavinia Warren, who was the wife of General Tom Thumb, and Henry Johnson, who is also known as Zip the Pinhead. And they were at the Dreamland, which is what it was called before it was burned down in 1911. There were so many problems with fires in New York City during the 1800s and early 1900s. So this guy named Samuel W. Gumpertz went into his own freak show business. He builds the Dreamland sideshow, and it was a huge success. And in 1920, this blows my mind, as many as 30,000 patrons a day were visiting this sideshow. And that was in its heyday. But by 1930, you were lucky to get 8,000. So carnivals developed during the last decade of the 19th century. Not every town was large enough to support an amusement park like Coney Island. So the carnival was sort of replicating that. Like, it provided for small town America what the large amusement park provided for the urban masses. And human oddities were exhibited there as well. And at first they weren't as highbrow as someone like Lavinia Warren. Like, they didn't attract like the prime sideshow exhibits. So they had things like wild men or geeks, and what were known as like minor freaks. Carnivals around 1904 become more lucrative. They were sort of copies of circus sideshows, and as it developed, the most popular show was the freak show at the carnival, which was considered central, again, to the financial well-being of the carnival. So the sideshow history is that it is usually the most important part of the circus or the carnival or the museum, quote unquote. So a few mass audience films featuring human oddities were released in the 1920s and 1930s, of which Tod Browning's Freaks is the most popular. And then this is kind of interesting to me, right? Because we're talking a lot about like, as with all things I talk about on this show, nothing is ever one thing, right? Like, the sideshow environment is obviously heavily exploitative, and it is also a place where people with disabilities are finally able to have community with each other.
That's what I was going to say, is the catch-22 of imagine yourself as a disabled person in the early 1900s, and you're forced to leave home, either sold from your family, adopted out, some type of conservatorship situation or caretaker situation, or by free will, and you're excited about your freedom to actually make maybe a little bit of your own money for the first time in your life. However, you're riding the caboose of the train and you're designated to a separate tent than everybody else. And so it's a hard juxtaposition to imagine yourself in, but it still happens in modern day society. Those hard conversations you have to have with yourself as somebody with a very noticeable physical disability, where you can start to feel like, am I exploiting myself? Am I allowing this to happen? Or am I allowing other people's perceptions and, questions to get to you? Like, well, if by for example, myself, when I joined the circus, I had a pretty fun role, and I was in a corset like everyone else. I was in makeup with everyone else. I had gorgeous costumes. I was running around with a little riding crop and was like the mistress, the madam character who was keeping all of the other minions in line, and was right-hand woman to the ringmaster. And maybe that harkens back on like the nobility and like the hierarchy and all of that. But at the same time, it shows that those people were trusted with some positions of power within the circus. And that really started to pop up with people like P.T. Barnum, who eventually saw the realness that somebody like Lavinia Warren brought to his business mindset and her business mindset on what they were able to achieve. And you mentioned so many things that I have like cosmic ties to.
Wow.
Also, like you mentioned 3 specific things that I've either been a part of productions or very serious high profile auditions where all of these stories were flirted about, or just the opportunity to be able to play characters that were a part of that world. And one of them was the freak show season of American Horror Story way back in the day, maybe 10 years ago. Ryan Murphy and his crew flew me to New Orleans to go be a part of the show. And I was like, obviously, of course, yes, and was already used to a circus. And I knew once I went out there, I was going to meet all these other circus performers, including all these other little people. And I was there billed as the role Mon Petite, who is in that season. And I got to spend an entire day with Jessica Lange and had, a wonderful time working with her. And we were shooting the promos, and then hearkening back to that circus world of one of my circus friends, he always used to say, Katrina, if you want to be small, be the smallest. If you want to be tall, be the tallest. Whatever you do, like, bill yourself as whatever is the most extreme. And, I ended up losing the television role of Mon Petite to the woman who was the world's smallest woman at that time. And she is the actress who you end up seeing in the final season of that show. I was in the commercials, but, I was like, it makes sense to, hell yeah, book the smallest woman in the world. She needs gigs too. And then you also mentioned Lavinia Warren. I want to say, again, maybe 9-10 years ago, I had the opportunity to do at least 3 or 4 very, very intense pages and pages of monologues as Lavinia, with a project that Hugh Jackman had signed on to. And originally, that story was going to be about P.T. Barnum and more a biography on his rise of circus stardom, his impact, and how he, wasn't a perfect person, but how he changed pop culture and he changed other people's lives that were surrounding him within the circus. And one of those things was giving people opportunities because he saw the value in them. And it was somebody who had written this, wrote it in such a way that they alluded to the fact that Lavinia and P.T. Barnum actually had chemistry and maybe had some secret sort of love affair and attraction that was very, very, very strong for Lavinia, because he did go and scout her and essentially begged her to join his circus when he visited her hometown, and made sure that he was gifting her things and assuring her family that she would be taken care of. But he was like, oh, she's a businesswoman. She was more taken care of. She was healthy. She, was obviously beautiful and adorable. And he was like, I want all of that. Of course, that doesn't look good for somebody in his status to be fraternizing, dating, whatever, somebody with a disability. And that would compromise his ultimate goal, which was to be like the king of his own kingdom, which has reverberated into employers who I've met that have fetishes for people with disabilities, and specifically hiring people with dwarfism who, they just really want to be, I call them LP collectors, and LP is short for little people collectors. But, and I'll always end up hearing later those people saying in interviews and whatnot, oh, I want to be the next P.T. Barnum, and so on. And so I thought it was an interesting take that this writer of the screenplay had taken, where obviously it would later show that, again, with our current society, studio execs were not willing to take that next step to go deeper into Lavinia's story. or General Tom Thumbs. And so they veered over to having me also read for the male role of Tom later on. And then the whole thing ended up getting scrapped and turned into that Hugh Jackman musical. Oh my God.
The Greatest Showman.
The Greatest Showman. And it became, like a P.T. Barnum High School Musical moment.
Right.
And, they ended up putting a little sprinkle of that idea of how huge the impact was that people of dwarfism had within his circuses. But because of our society today, they were like, actually, in order to sell more tickets, in their mind, they're like, we also need to CGI the actor with dwarfism's face. We're going to CGI his body. And also, we're not going to train him how to sing or do any accent training. So we're just going to dub over him. And it's still in such a way, just a modern reminiscent idea of like, if Lavinia and Tom Thumb, who were married at the time, they were essentially like the Brad and Angelina of their time. And like they were even given access by Abe Lincoln to have their wedding at the White House and so on. Like the magnitude of their impact on pop culture at that time, it just has so much little recognition today that I just thought that was such an interesting story. But it just shows that a lot of people are not ready to have those conversations and admit to the fact that there is such a large impact that people with disabilities have had on art through putting themselves out there in their physicalness.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because again, like I'm saying, like these acts were the ones that were making the money. Like these places could not have survived without the freak shows. And yeah, that really illustrates that point of that part being written out of The Greatest Showman. It's just more like sweeping it under the rug by like the 1950s. Well, actually really by the late 1930s, the rise of eugenics and the belief that undesirable traits, quote unquote, should be bred out, that was on the rise, and the freak shows suffered and eventually disappeared. So again, more catch-22s, because people began to see these shows as unsavory and exploitative. And freaks went from curiosities, quote unquote, to humble and unfortunate pathological rarities. And in fact, these sort of patronizingly, quote unquote, sympathetic viewpoints actually fed into the eugenics movement. And it was believed that it was cruel to allow people with deformities to exist and breed. So it wasn't that it was like, oh, this is exploitative. People should just have equal rights. It's exploitative. Let's hide them, actually. Like, nobody wants to see that. And it's like between the double bind of the two, like which one is the better? Like being held up as a performer in a freak show and, being able to have community or being like hidden away again. And viewed as like quote unquote mistake instead of like a curiosity to sort of be celebrated. So it was, it's the double bind there that like so many oppressed people have to deal with. And by the late 1930s, the transformation of those with physical and mental anomalies from curiosities to quote unquote diseased people was like complete. So by the 1950s, the freak show, as we see in the American Horror Story season, is like very looked down on. They're disappearing and
on its way out.
Its way out. Yeah, exactly.
And there's an very, very interesting documentary that I was a part of last year. It hasn't been released yet, but I'm just going to tell you because I know that you would find it interesting. But we go over a lot of these topics within dwarfism history, and then simultaneously, the entire film was spearheaded and made by people with dwarfism.
Amazing.
And there are a very diverse group of crew members that helped make it all happen at the Baryshnikov Center in New York City. And we have stories that are cut with narrative monologue sequences written by people with dwarfism about famous photos in history. And they've chosen subjects within the photos to write in first person as them. And one of those characters I ended up playing was taken from a photo of the Singers Midgets, which was a famous group of little people who were constantly interchangeable. And when circuses were on their way out and during the Depression, when, you know, even food was hard to come by for an average person, they were grouping little people together in such a way that, you know, it was still allowing sort of a kind of a bridge between circus and vaudeville, because some of those little people would have other talents that the average height owners of these troops were riding the coattails of. And then they would just go through these towns and pluck and purchase and trade all of these other little people. And one of those women, we don't know her name, but they plucked her out of this photo. And this amazing writer, performer, who I'm good friends with, her name's Sarah Fulkins, she wrote this narrative of a woman who has dwarfism, and she's a lesbian in this troupe. Without saying she's a lesbian, she basically shares this long-winded monologue about how she's lost the love of her life, who is another woman with dwarfism who we don't know. But all we know is that her girlfriend, who she was sharing a bed with, sharing pieces of food with, sharing clothes with, was essentially taken in the night and sold without any prior knowledge. And to say, like, as somebody who has a beautiful partner currently, and she's a beautiful burlesque performer and person inside and out, like, I can't imagine at that time if, you know, and we had met through the circus, that if we met in the circus just some decades ago, you know, we could be torn apart without ever being able to reconnect. And so the character is reaching out to this photographer person that's on the other, essentially the gaze of the audience, begging this person, like, here's my information. If you see her, tell her this is our next stop, and so on and so on and so on. And it was just heartbreaking. And I was like, I have to be a part of this, you know. It's they're right now still in the post-production phase, but it's going to be called How We Look. And the directors are Julie Wyman, who is a professor at UC Davis. She is somebody who has dwarfism, but didn't essentially know that throughout her life. She ended up finding out later in life. And she's also queer. And her creative director, Sophia Cheyenne, who is also a disability advocate and one of the people who's spearheading now, like, the very first diversity wing of Little People of America. So it's going to be a very interesting project.
That sounds amazing.
And they also go into the idea of, a first person look as a male presenting person being subject in one of those nobility paintings of the Renaissance period, and his first person account of what it's like to be a grown-ass man, but he's subservient to a very young prince who
Right.
has his hand on top of his head. So it's always playing with those themes of emasculation and gender discrepancy. And I'm really, really looking forward to it coming out.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And especially that there's this aspect of queer disability history, which is so hidden and so like worthy and fascinating and interesting to talk about. And yeah, I was like getting chills when you were talking about the little person with in the lesbian relationship and like comparing that to your own life. Like, yeah, so true and pertinent of, we're not that far away from that. And
no, not at all.
Exactly. And just the experience of like, not only being a little person, but also being a woman, not just being a woman, being a queer woman. And, just the layers there of oppression and what those women would have had to deal with. I find very moving to talk about. So I'm really excited to see that. And really, it's really amazing that you got to do that monologue.
And Freaks is such a visual representation of that photo that they used for this documentary, because Frida is given such limited options. And even though Hans also has dwarfism, he still has the freedom to choose.
Yes.
Whereas Frida only has the ability and the strength to advocate for herself the only ways that she knows how. Yeah,
and I mean, she's on my most recent rewatch of this for this episode, I was like, well, this is the best character. Like, Frida is the best character in the film, and it's like, so we don't talk about her enough. So I'm excited to get into that. But
yeah.
I first wanted to give some background about Tod Browning. So Tod Browning was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1880. And as a child, he would perform shows in his backyard that he charged the neighborhood kids to watch. And he ran away from home when he was 16 and joined the circus, where he worked as a clown and a contortionist. So he had a lot of exposure and experience with circus performers, which probably lends itself to the extremely sympathetic view that he takes in this film. And he later worked in vaudeville. His film career began with acting, and he was directing features within 4 years. His first film was called The Lucky Transfer. It's from 1915. He made several films with Lon Chaney. These films were known for alarming audiences, as well as making a lot of money. And in the films, Chaney often played physically disabled characters for shock effect. He also famously played the Phantom of the Opera, right? So it's all sort of tied together. Interesting fact about Lon Chaney: he was a child of deaf adults, so that is part of why he was so, and he knew ASL, and that was part of why he was so apt at pantomime in silent films, because growing up, he communicated with his parents through, facial expression and through ASL, which, you know, if you really want to emphasize something in my understanding in sign language, you know, you have to really, you know, emphasize it with your body to really like convey what the emotion of what you're talking about. So when he died, a whole group of disabled people, including many little people, came to his funeral service to honor him as a member of the community. So that's, I feel like, important for his story.
Yeah, anybody that has more than one little person show up to a party or a funeral, like, you're cool as hell.
Yes, absolutely.
It's very known within our community too. Like,
yes.
Oh yeah, he's cool. He's with us.
I fucking agree. Like that's there. What kind of party are you having if there are no disabled people there? Like,
right. And I feel like the men that made this movie happen, they were people who were just like, oh, like so comfortable with disabled bodies and lives and outlook and point of view that they were like, oh, it's just a given. Like, we're just telling a story about people. But what's going to be interesting is that now it's like somewhat of an expose of what everybody, you know, who loves show business really is like, that look behind the curtain, that look behind the tent, that voyeuristic idea of what's really going on behind there before they come out and are like showing that professionalism.
right.
You know, I had a really interesting quote here actually that I looked up and saw. It was somebody from the New Yorker named John Mosher, or Mosher perhaps. He wrote a review of the movie. He called it a little gem that stands in a class by itself and probably won't be forgotten in a hurry by those who see it. He said that Freaks was a perfectly plausible story, which is what I love about the film. He said a key to the effectiveness of its horror, writing that it's a chilling notion, I would imagine, for people to imagine these weird beings with their own lives and vanities and passions, all allied in a bitter enmity against us. And I just thought that quote was so interesting because it, you know, I still get it all the time in such a way in modern day is like people who come up to me with so many questions of like either assuming that I only live off of the government and that I'm somehow, you know, just bypassing having to do anything hard in life because this myth that if you have a disability, you easily get some kind of government subsidy, which is just not true.
No.
And it's not my life at all.
It's not easy to get.
I've never received such a thing because if I did, you are not allowed to have more than around $2,000 or $3,000 worth of assets, and that's just not survivable for me as a working professional in Los Angeles with multiple careers. And so it's very much like that idea. People come up to me with assuming this about me already, so their questions are extremely lowbrow, like, you know, do you wish you were tall? And
I wish you were dead.
You know, they're like, do you wish you could, you know, do you have jobs? Can you work? Can you read? Can you write? Like these kinds of things. And I'm just like,
oh my gosh,
y'all, like, turn a freaking television on and watch a reality show or something. Like, you know, it's really, really wild. And so I love that quote because it is so hard for people to imagine that. Also, you know, going back to that, have all throughout my life, I get a lot of people who have openly stated to me they have a fear of little people. And it's like, no matter what race, gender, a person with dwarfism is, they are afraid of us because of, and I always ask them, their answer is always because of XYZ horror film that painted a little person in such a way, or a little person actor with practical effects makeup or something freaked them out, like, as a child. And I'm like, we are truly the last acceptable group of people to be spoken to so openly this way, because I cannot imagine somebody walking up to one of my Asian friends or Black friends or Hispanic friends and saying, I have a fear of you. Let's talk about that. Why do
Just
I have
openly.
a fear of you?
They'll talk about it alone, but they won't talk about it to your face.
Exactly. But little people are seen as such a non-threat that that's how we've been, acceptably seen. So for freaks to show a group of people with disabilities banding together and being a motherfucking threat, that must have been like,
terrifying.
Holy shit, everything that me, an average height, able-bodied person, have been told, like, is a lie. Like, who else could possibly, have more confidence than me, or have more autonomy? And at that time, when the film was coming out and the depression is going on, oh my God, they have a job and I don't.
Right.
So it's all of these, like, ticking of all these boxes and things that these men did to really try and get into people's psyche by just showing people with disabilities being their damn selves. Mm-hmm. And I love some of my favorite scenes in the film are there is no talking even happening. It's just showing people with disabilities being, living, which is so powerful at that time, because it would have been so many questions of that people may not even be asking themselves, which is such a huge part of our dwarfism advocacy is like, put yourself in our shoes. If you are the height of an average height child, how would you expect to make your way around the world and be expected to do and live as a functioning adult? So the people in this film are functioning adults and they are just fine, but then of course, just with the modern world, it's like we still have those discrepancies between genders, queerness, and racism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, in the film itself, like, has complicated history of some of these double binds. Like, for example, the film was also, re-released as The Monster Story or Forbidden Love or Nature's Mistakes, as a way to sort of market it to like a more mainstream audience. It was partly based on a short story called Spurs from 1923, which was written by Tod Browning and published in Munsey's magazine. So it was a pulp story originally. And Browning had known of the story for years before filming through his friend Harry Earls, who plays Hans. So Harry Earls and Tod Browning were actually friends. They might have met through the circus circuit. MGM art department chief Cedric Gibbons was a childhood friend of Tod Browning, so it was easy to purchase the story for $8,000. And it was released by MGM to compete with Universal Horror. So Tod Browning had also made Dracula in 1931 through Universal, which was like a huge hit. So Freaks producer Irving Thalberg told him like he had to compete by making the scariest film possible. So Thalberg was certain that the film would be successful because of Dracula and all of Tod Browning's other horror films. So all of the actors in this film that we see who play the sideshow performers, the freaks, were actual sideshow performers in real life. Many of them were seasoned professionals. Harry Earls was a German actor with dwarfism who plays Hans, and he was part of the Doll family, and which they were also in The Wizard of Oz. And he had also worked with Tod Browning already on The Unholy Three from 1925, which was also based on a Todd Robbins novel. So I'm going to get into all of the performers when we go through the actual plot of the film. But Myrna Loy and Jean Harlow were originally considered for the leading roles, but it was...
Oh, wow.
Right. Can you imagine Jean Harlow? That would have been amazing. Olga Baklanova plays the villainous female lead. And she recalls initially being disturbed by the performers playing the freaks and then eventually befriending them. So the shooting only happened in 9 weeks in 1931. The other people on the MGM lot, other workers, were so disturbed by the sideshow performers that the film's cast and crew were segregated to a separate commissary and separated from the actors and crew members working on other films. So on-set reactions to the freaks led many executives. They were afraid that people wouldn't go see the movie, so they petitioned for the film to be stopped, and the production was kept as non-visible as possible. So this movie was actually made against all odds, honestly. And they were really, again, like, it's a very sympathetic film, and at the same time, like, the working conditions must have been so messed up to experience, like that segregation. There was a lot of sensational marketing. The film was advertised with a warning that children will not be permitted to see this picture, and adults not in normal health are urged not to. There was the tagline, "Can a full-grown woman truly love a midget?" Like, it was very, like, sensationalized. Like, could that
That's
really
actually
be
a birthday gift I bought years later for my ex, who she had originally showed me the film, was a vintage poster of this film. And I was like, I'm always somebody like, you will never catch me using the word midget because it's just, it's a slur. And
100%.
People who argue that, I would just always ask them, name a time that was a positive word.
Right.
And they can never name a positive interaction with that word. So I have in such a way felt that I reclaimed that word through this film. And I had purchased a vintage thing that said, can a grown woman truly love a midget? And it was like, still to this day, one of my favorite movie posters, because it's like, bitch, yes.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah. And now,
I love
years
that.
later, being a part of a vaudeville scene here in LA, it's just so awesome to be like having that reality and having more of a freedom here in Los Angeles, And I had a guy I won this designer sweater contest with. He was like, you can make a sweater on anything. And he makes very like vintage looking, like handmade sweaters out of these old, like, they look like old blankets, but he's like, you can print whatever you want on them. And so I printed multiple versions of the different freaks posters onto the sleeves, onto the back, and on the front it does say the OG quote, like, can a grown woman truly love a midget, with like freaks going across my chest.
I'm obsessed with that.
I've worn it out and nobody ever questions me on it saying like midget on it. I think because I'm usually, or when I do wear it, I'm normally around like people working in the industry. And so people will come up to me who I think recognize that it's being like reclaimed in such a way. And I'm so thankful for that. And it just makes me want to like make more stuff like that, because it does get such a reaction. And I'm such a like slut for
yes
chaotic reactions.
I fucking love that. I mean, that's why you're the perfect guest for this show. I mean, honestly, when you're like, I gave it to my girlfriend, I'm like, that's so hot. Like,
yeah,
that's amazing because like
that was one of my better presents.
Yes. I mean, it's just like so, I mean, obviously, because I'm like a lesbian, I'm more excited by that. It's just so much more exciting when it's two women. I'm like,
I had to tell you that.
Yes.
I had to tell you that.
Yes. The movie bombed at the box office. The film did well in some cities, like Cincinnati, Minneapolis, Buffalo, and Boston. It had mixed critical reviews. Variety faulted the film for its too fantastic romance, claiming that a direct quote, "It is impossible for a normal man or woman to sympathize with the aspiring midget." To which I say, fuck off. Maybe for you.
Oh my God. I remember there was a review while traveling with Love Never Dies through the Midwest. And it was such a stark difference from like traveling through all the cities in California and on the East Coast and so on. And of course, we get to Ohio and I wake up to like 45 messages. And it's like my cast members advocating for me because a review of our like 3-week run had just come out, and it was like literally the opening like sentence describing me, like a principal performer was like, "The midget ran around."
Oh my God.
And it was just like we had gone through so many hundreds of shows by that point, and my cast members knew how like integral my character was to the story that they were just like, "What?" And obviously, like, they felt more educated and empowered to speak on my behalf in that scenario. So before I could even, like, wake up and see what had happened, the person, like, begrudgingly wrote this, like, shady email back and, like, took it down and just said, like, the short one or something like that.
Oh, my God.
But then tried to say, like, well, colloquially, midget was used back during the time that this story was taking place.
Okay, but that's not what you were saying.
No, sweetie.
Yeah.
You're going to take that down.
Right. Yeah, you're going to take it down right now. Yeah. I'm sorry you had to experience that, and also so glad that people advocated for you.
Yeah, it's just so funny how that word midget is used by so many films and projects over the years to sensationalize through critics or like gossip rags. Yes. And even, like Wizard of Oz, for example, had so much drama before it came out because there were all of these reports that, the midgets were in a drunken rage and they were molesting Dorothy. And
which never happened.
Well, the truth is that there were 2 or 3 very chaotic people within the group of Munchkin performers, and those people I've actually become friends with one of their family members who's now like a very prominent producer, and funnily enough, he's actually 7 feet tall, but he had 2 uncles who were little people.
Oh, wow.
And they were also in a love triangle with, they were Munchkins in Wizard of Oz, also in a love triangle with one of the women who was a Munchkin. And she left one for the other, and it was causing drama for them while they were on the set of that film. And then there's a documentary that came out in the early 2000s I was recently watching, and they were mentioning, is it true that you guys caused all this drama and blah, blah, blah? They were like, we had the best time ever. Everything was chill. However, I know for a fact they were putting like 3 people to a bed and, treating them separately from the rest of the crew, right, and putting adults with children on set because, little people are completely interchangeable in that way. And, they said that it wasn't everyone. It was like a couple of bad eggs. But of course, these critics and gossip rags just like went to town on trying to like sensationalize and sell the film in that way.
Of course, because like able-bodied people never have drama on set or anything.
Yeah. And there's another film I was a part of during the pandemic. It's called Seeing Deanne Arbus, and it's based on the very infamous, freak loving photographer, and how she was also, orchestrated to be this person who was exploiting little people and wasn't really seen as serious artist until, after she passed away. And a disability rights movement really changed. But the director of that film, Lindsay Ziebach, amazing director, she, studied under and was assisting like Guillermo del Toro on his films. And so the film is very reminiscent of that like horror thriller vibe, but then it gets very real when it comes to Deanne meeting my character. And I play basically a scorned ex-Munchkin actress from Wizard of Oz who recognized that I used the film Wizard of Oz as a vehicle to find my way out of poverty and getting a job. However, if you see the film, you'll see that, and I worked with the director on this, but she allowed me to add actual like historical accounts within the monologue of like, yeah, everybody thinks it's great and everybody wants to ask this, the Munchkins, how was it? How was Oz? How was Oz? How was Oz? Like that's their whole like believed like identity. But in fact, it was very hard and it was very exploitive. And a lot of people thought surely like this is going to lead to other things and so on and so on. But, again, Wizard of Oz, not a commercial success until much later on. And these people a lot of them were like refugees of the war going on in Europe who were able to use Wizard of Oz as a way to get out of that situation and come to America and meet other people just like them.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. Really interesting because, during World War II, people with disabilities were being killed and genocided and, that there's...
Well, and the whole eugenics movement that was going on when this film was made was happening at a time where in America there was Nazi sympathizers.
Exactly.
And before they knew about, concentration camps and what all was really going on and how much territory, the Nazis were able to take over, there were people in America who were like, you know what, that guy, he's actually saying some really interesting things I might agree with. And so I see these quotes that, you've mentioned of people, saying like that, it's a way to sympathize that by ending a disabled person's life or ability to even be conceived it's good for them.
Right.
This is so they don't have to live with the horror of what we as a society will do to them if they're born. And It's so crazy because, there's a family at this time, a very famous family of people with dwarfism. They actually have the same type of dwarfism as me. They were the Ovitz family, and they were essentially a vaudeville troupe that all had different talents, who were traveling across Europe when they got interested by the Nazis who were going to put them in the gas chamber. And right before they put them in the gas chamber, that infamous Nazi general and doctor Goebbels caught them just in time and was like, what do you think you're doing? Like, I want these people. And he was obsessed with them, and he had them perform at, for all of the generals and everybody who was visiting, and they were traveling with him. And there's an interview remaining alive women who, her family's like, sweetie, you've been gaslit. And she's still somewhat like in a Stockholm syndrome where she's like, he saved my life. And I'm now, almost 90 years old and able to talk to you. And I'm, able to be a free woman and live with my family. However, her family's like, but remember, he did all these hideous tests on you, and he was trying to fuck with your DNA, and he, forced you to perform and exploited you and killed millions of people. And, and it was still like hard for her to like see like the larger scope of all of that, even in just like her lifetime. And with the catch-22 with all of that is the science that has helped me and my longevity as a person with dwarfism came from that monster testing on people with dwarfism, among many other disabilities. And so because of that, then you see more medical science happening in America that was able to make its way over and start really talking about and hammering down on where the gene of dwarfism came from. How is it in some families? Why is it showing up randomly in others? And so on and so on and so on, all came from that horror.
Right.
And it's just, I can't even imagine for somebody like that woman who had to watch all of her family members die before her, who all had dwarfism, and just kind of be alone with that idea that like, thank God he saved us, but also it's so
really
convoluted.
Heavy. It's heavy. Yeah. It's complicated. I mean, it's like how modern gynecology is all based on experiments done on enslaved women in the United States.
Right.
Like it's a very like dark history, and it's something that it's not history. It's very much in the present. It's very much happening right now. Time as I could get all philosophical with it, time as like a linear construct is human invention. Like you can argue that all of these things are existing side by side all the time. And these histories are like very, it encapsulates that idea.
We'll make her one of us, a loving cup, a loving cup. We accept her, one of us. We accept her, one of us.
Gooba gobble, gooba gobble.
We accept her, we accept her. Google gobble, Google gobble. One of us, one of us. Google gobble.
They're going to make you one of them, my peacock. Gooba gobble.